What is wrong with a house that's acquired by 4 successive occupants over the years, each time with tragic consequences? And especially, what is amiss with the room its first owner, Race Butterfield, a small-time crook, enlarges by converting 3 of its already large ground floor rooms into one where he intends to hold grand parties? Having purchased an enormous crystal chandelier for it, he's told by the dealer that it has a history. A young society woman is rumoured to have hanged herself from it after her lover left her when she lost her entire fortune in the Wall Street crash of 1929. Race, with no time for such tales, installs it in the new room he calls his Chandelier Ballroom. But who is the mystery woman who warns each successive occupant of betrayal by their partner, leading to dire consequences for both betrayer and betrayed? Elizabeth Lord, author of 23 successful novels, reads an extract from her latest novel, The Chandelier Ballroom, available worldwide on Amazon Kindle. Ruth Rendell describes Elizabeth Lord as a natural storyteller.
Chapter 1. The letter had come from a solicitor he'd never heard of, scaring the living daylights out of him. Now that the first shock had subsided, it lay open on the coffee table, with Horace Butterfield, known to most as Race, reading it for a second time, now with only one thought racing through his head. Someone had to be stitching him up. Reading it over his shoulder, his wife Millicent was suspicious too. "It's too bloody good to be true, Race. You're going to have to phone these people. Find out who they are, what they're up to, who they're working for." "If it's a catch," he replied slowly, "it's a damn silly one. What do they expect to gain?" Seeing the name of an unknown law firm on the envelope, his first thought had been that little bastard Linkman had gone to the police after all about the job they'd done just over a week ago. Or maybe he hadn't, because as yet no police had come nosing round, but you never can tell. Last week he stood over snivelling Linkman after he and 2 of his mates had given him a going-over. Glaring down at the bruised and blooded upturned features, he'd warned, "You go bleaching to the face, and it'll be the last thing you ever do." The job hadn't gone well. They'd only just made it before the police arrived. Cautioning the elderly night watchman on the bonds as he was making a phone call to them, they'd had to leg it quick, but Linkman had been terrified that they'd killed the old boy. He had been pretty ancient. They hadn't. The local paper reported him recovering in hospital, but it had been too much of a close shave. Robbery with violence. All 4 would have gone down for a long stretch. He was 53. At his age, the last thing he wanted was to end up doing 15 years or more. It hadn't even been a big job. None of them were these days, and he had this feeling he was getting past it. All his life, he'd been only slightly better than Petty Cook, dreaming of becoming someone carrying off the big heists, but somehow never quite rising very far up the rungs in the criminal world. "'Cause you're too bloody nice trying to act a bloody gentleman all the time." That would come up every time she's scoffing at his efforts to prove himself from a hard upbringing. "You can't be nice in your game," she'd nag, her harsh cockney tone grating on his nerves. "You need to have a bit more clout." He thought he did. Prone to a quick and vicious temper, he wasn't above giving someone good hiding, like Linkman. As he ripped the letter open, he had been sure Linkman had squealed, despite his warning. Now all that was being flushed from his mind as he whispered, "If this letter's genuine, then it's a bloody fortune. It can't be true." Millie was gazing down at the legal wording. "I ain't never heard of this Robert Sacker person. If this ain't a set-up, then it's got to be a mistake." Race looked up at her with faint irritation. Her acid remarks never failed, even with the money like this staring them in the face. But the remark was beginning to make him think clearer now that the initial fear had passed on first ripping open that envelope. Yes, you have, he said. He was my dad's brother. You only ever saw him the once. He turned up at the church at our wedding, right out the blue, then left. Didn't come back to the house, just left. Not set eyes of him on him from that day on. That was 24 years ago, she said. Bloody long time. It was. They'd married in 1901. Before that, he'd only ever met his father's brother a couple of times as a kid. After the shock of seeing him at their wedding, he'd forgotten all about him, until this letter arrived, telling him that his Uncle Robert was dead. As if he cared, except that the contents of the letter was saying him as the man's only surviving relative. It explained that he'd left no heir, made no will, that after all his estate had been sold to settle the usual outgoings, Race himself had been found to be the sole surviving beneficiary. He still couldn't have believed it. I hardly remember him, he muttered. I only saw him a couple of times as a kid when my parents were alive. They died in 1898, leaving me to be shoved into an orphanage. Then he turned up at the church the day of our wedding. I certainly didn't invite him. I took it he'd died years ago. He gave a chuckle. Of course, he isn't now, he quipped, then sobered. The letter said he never married or had any children. His only relative was my dad. Seems he was a bit of a recluse. But to be worth all this much, 50-odd thousand quid. When most blokes earn about, 30 bob a week, maybe 2 quid. There must be a catch somewhere. And if there ain't, then we're bloody rich.
Download now on Kindle and Kindle apps.